History and Story of the Trials of Saint Alessia, the Nedic slave who rebelled against the alien overlords and made a pact with Akatosh to become the first Dragonborn. Please note, Alessia is only the first Dragonborn in recorded history. Miraak was the first, but no record really exists of him being Dragonborn, or of him even existing at all except for as the Betrayer, until he revealed himself in the 4th era during the events of the Elder Scrolls V Dragonborn. So first, we're going to start off with the obvious. Who was Alessia? Alessia was a human born in what was known as Sard, which is now known as Sardavar Lead. What her original name may have been is unknown. Alessia is actually a clipping of the title bestowed upon her by her followers, Alesh, meaning High Princess. Another name given to her was Pravant, meaning the First. From these two titles, she was given many different names, such as Perif and Aleshnut. To all humans born in Cyrodiil during the First Era, she was born slave to the Aelids, the wild elves who ruled the area of Cyrodiil during the First and Merethic eras. She prayed to Akatosh and the Aedra for freedom from the Aelids, who, at least to the human slaves, seemed to worship the Daedra. Scholars have deduced the Aelids, though never truly united in religion, seemed to center their worships around the Aedra until the late Merethic era, where Daedric cults among the various Aelid tribes rose to power. Even then, there were only two major deities they seemed to have worshipped, Magnus and Meridia, whom they knew as Meridnunda, because the two of them represented a personification of the most sacred element, light itself. Alessia's prayers were answered by 3 visions from the Aedra at Sancrator. Through them, Akatosh bestowed upon Alessia 3 gifts. The first gift, he tore open his own heart and muscle, offering to her as the Amulet of Kings, as he is King of Spirits and she would be Queen of Mortals. The second gift, he offered her a handful of his own blood, through which she would be granted the first of the dragon fires, and as long as they burned, the gates of oblivion would remain shut. The third gift, he offered her guidance to shape her empire, where she would rule as Queen of Queens, so long as the Amulet of Kings remained whole. Soon after, she established her holy city in Sancrator, beginning an open revolt against the Aelids. She worked alongside Morahouse, the winged man-bull mortal son of Kinnereth, and Aelid rebel lords, where they eventually made their way to the capital city of the White Gold Tower. Though initially hesitant to assault the Aelid's most heavily fortified center, Pellinor Whitestrike led the charge, storming the tower, where he slew the king of the Aelids, the sorcerer, Umaril the Unfeathered. Morahouse and Alessia soon followed with their armies, taking the citadel. Many of the Aelids did eventually flee to Valenwood. In First Era, year 243, Alessia declared herself Empress of the new Cyrodiilic Empire, taking the Amulet of Kings as divine providence that she was to rule. She then established the open religion of the 8 Divines, who would later become the 9 with the Transcendence of Talos. Some years later, Alessia, now on her deathbed, was visited once more by Akatosh. In some stories, she was visited by Shazar, and was granted sainthood, being immortalized as Saint Alessia. When she finally died in First Era 266, she was buried in the catacombs beneath Sancrator. This would later become tradition by Riemann Cyrodiil and his successors, who would also be buried in those catacombs. Some stories do counter this, asserting that she was instead buried underneath the Temple of the One in the Imperial City. Under Alessia, the Alessian Empire, there were only a few rulers who were known to history. Alessia herself in First Era 243, Belarza, the man-bull son of Saint Alessia and Demi-Prince Morehouse in First Era year 266, Gorius in First Era year 461, and Hestra, who expanded the Cyrodiilic Empire all the way into High Rock itself in First Era year 1029. Among the Empire's more defining moments was the rise of the monotheistic Alessian order that followed the teaching of the prophet Maruk, whose teachings questioned the validity of elven rule. The same teachings that led to the rise of the Alessian order, and he also went on to write the Alessian Doctrines, which provided the base laws for the Alessian Empire. And he was also credited with the phrase, "All are guilty until they prove themselves innocent," which was thought by some to be a cruel concept at the time. It was said Maruk began his teachings after he spoke to the Enlightened One, Maruk and his priest's name for Saint Alessia, in a vision. He taught that the elves were not fit to rule, and that to defy the emperor was to defy the gods. His belief is somewhat supported in the fact that Akatosh himself essentially supplanted Alessia as empress in the first place. the borders of the Alessian Empire fluctuated much during its life. At its inception, it encompassed East Cyrodiil, including the Nibene Valley and the White Gold Tower. West Cyrodiil remained under the control of the Colovian kings, who initially resisted Alessian's right to rule, though they eventually joined the Empire's allied territories. Many of the alien lords who supported and allied with Alessia were allowed to remain in control of the realms, becoming vassal states of the Alessian Empire. These vassal states were meticulously dissolved by the Alessian Order. With the death of High King Keurig the White in First Era 478, the Empire made attempts to seize portions of southern Skyrim, and though they mostly succeeded, they failed to acquire the Kingdom of Skingrad. The Empire attempted to annex High Rock, but were thwarted at the Battle of Glanumbra Moors in First Era 482, and this would later be remembered as one of the Empire's most disastrous mistakes. However, in First Era year 1029, Empress Hestra defeated King Styrich, the vampire of Verkath, and successfully conquered High Rock. And then, in First Era year 2305, High Rock regained its sovereignty, reasserting their independence in response to the Alessian Order's growing excess. In First Era year 2321, the Colovian kings of West Cyrodiil broke away from the Empire, establishing the Colovian Estates, completely severing all ties with the Alessian Empire. Struggling with finances under the weight of controlling their land, the First Empire finally broke under the strain, and the War of Righteousness erupted. After a decade of war that annihilated at least half the population of the Iliac Bay and saw the destruction of the Alessian Order's monastery complex at Lake Canulus, it finally ended in First Era year 2331, with the dissolution of the Alessian Empire. The Alessian Order purportedly collapsed at the same time. Cyrodiil and the rest of Tamriel would remain divided until the rise of Riemann I and the Second Empire in First Era year 2703. Well guys, thank you for watching. I hope you learned a little bit about the Alessian Empire and Saint Alessia herself. This is the Full Metal Admin, signing off. Stay metal, guys.